Well, I remember when I was looking at places to do a PhD, I had decided I wanted to work in groundwater. And I think it was just a chance of reading the journal Groundwater that really gave me the incentive to focus on that area. And there were not, at that time, there were probably only half a dozen schools that kind of offered a program in groundwater throughout the US.
Wow.
So I wrote to the people that were working in that field, and one of them was my PhD, would become my PhD advisor.
Hmm.
He was just getting started here at Nebraska, and he, in his response letter, this is back when we wrote letters, and through the mail, so it took quite a bit of time. But he encouraged me to apply, and he also said that he might have some projects that I could work on that would fund my PhD work. So I don't know if you call it the good fortune or not so good fortune, but my PhD advisor was funded to start the Water Sciences Laboratory here at the University of Nebraska while I was working on my PhD. So I
Okay.
applied for and obtained the lab manager position and the original lab manager position at the laboratory that I now direct in the middle of my PhD. So I worked full time while I finished my doctorate degree. So
Oh,
it's like a PhD, or it's like a postdoc, but it's actually way harder to do things that way, working full time and finishing your doctorate. So I would not recommend that to most people. I would just, well, there's been two things. One, everything is driven and controlled by computers. When I started in analytical chemistry, there were almost no computers in the laboratory. And now everything is controlled by computer. That's good and bad. It's good because it does relieve some of the tedium that's associated with, say, data reduction from converting a signal into a concentration. It's bad because it takes a little bit of the science away from the person that's operating the equipment. I remember the first mass spectrometer I used had vacuum tubes, and it used a strip chart recorder and dials basically to make adjustments. And having those dials and turning them and seeing the response in the equipment actually gives you a tactile sense that you cannot get with any equipment today because it's all computer controlled. Do your own data reduction. So that's one thing that I believe is really necessary in order to understand what you're doing, is to not trust the computer, right? Do your own data reduction and convince yourself that the computer is giving you the right answer. I'd say one is to talk about your work. So go to conferences, present your work, and then invite questions. So I think one thing, if you want to go into science, if you want to go into any field in academia, you need to be open to suggestions and criticisms from the get-go. You cannot take any comments or criticisms personally, because your colleagues are trying to make your work as
yeah,
good as
yeah,
it
yeah.
can be.
Definitely.
And you cannot take any of those comments or criticisms personally. We're all in the business of creating new knowledge, and you have to respect your colleagues for trying to make what you're doing as good as it can be. So I think that's something young scientists don't really understand when they're getting into this field. Is you have to be open to different perspectives and different ways of interpreting what you're working on. What I look at are the other articles that are published in that journal, and I try to imagine what my article would look like for the same type of readership. So if it's something that I'm interested in that's published in that journal, I think it's fine. That looks like a good audience for this particular paper. I'd say my biggest challenge every day is having enough time to think, to respond to emails, to write, to communicate with my staff and my students. I just don't have enough time. And I've tried working on time management techniques.
Mm-hmm.
Some things work and some things don't work. But I see that time and time again from my colleagues is nobody seems to have enough time to get what they perceive as the most important tasks done every day. Prioritizing is I start to think about things that I have on my list and say, well, what would happen if I don't do that? Or can I give that task to somebody else to work on for me? So that's something as a director I needed to learn pretty early on was how can I delegate some of this work to the people that I supervise? And that's taken a lot of time. I'm not always good at communicating exactly how to do things. And I usually expect a response immediately. I'm somebody that really needs to get a response quickly. But that's one way to deal with time management is just to rely on your team to understand what needs to get done and your team to do many of the tasks that you find important. I'd say to manage a lab, you have to have a vision. You know, you have to look into the future and see or believe where your laboratory needs to be, say 5 years from now, and try to work from that perspective. It's very easy to just try to solve tasks and problems on a daily basis, but it's harder to look into the future and try to imagine what it would look like in the future. So keeping a long-term vision for a laboratory is really important, whether it's something like the water sciences laboratory or a personal laboratory. What is it? What are your goals in the long term? And then solving conflicts, I think that requires a lot of people skills. And that's something I've had to learn the hard way is every person, every student, every staff member is different. And I have to learn to appreciate and understand their perspective in solving conflicts. They don't see things the way that I do. So if I can put myself in their shoes, it makes it way easier to solve conflicts that always arise when you're working in groups of people. And really practical stuff is keeping your budgets in order. So the finances of a laboratory is like, managing the staff requires that you constantly check in with them and that you go over tasks and help them to solve the problems that they run into. I think that's part of conflict management is learning to teach your staff and your students how to solve their own problems. So keeping the workload on schedule. That's one thing in a laboratory like ours is that we have a very large influx of samples in our summer during our summertime and trying to make sure that we have everybody focused on getting those processed in a timely manner. So I think those are two things that I can think of is that you teach who you're working with how to solve their own problems. For a PhD, I'm usually asking them what they want to use it for. If they want to go on and be in a research laboratory or in academics, I tell them this is something that you only do for your personal benefit. You don't get a PhD for the money. You don't do it to guarantee success in a career. Really, a PhD is something that has to be a personal goal, a personal choice, because there are not that many jobs for PhDs. And you can certainly get a good paying job with a bachelor's or a master's degree in comparison. So I don't always encourage my graduate students to go on for a PhD for that reason. It's not just to get a better job. I look at their publications, and this could even go with the student. If they don't have any papers, then I would look at their conference presentations, anything that they published, because writing is extremely important in science. And if you don't know how to write, if you don't know how to get information and knowledge out into the literature, then you're not going to be successful. So that's one of the first things I look at is how well they write. I look at their practical experience. Practical
Yes,
experience
yes.
could be what they did as they were in school or even before they started school, what kind of work they did. Because
Hmm.
I feel like the more practical experience that you have, the more successful that you will be in academia or in research. If you've worked at a job where you have to use your hands, where you have to understand how to solve problems, you're going to be much more successful in a research career. I think the most critical problem that our planet faces today is the population of humans on this planet. It's increasing at an alarming rate. And the more people that we have on this planet, the more our resources are going to be stressed. It's not just a matter of producing enough food. We all are require a greater standard of living, a better standard of living. And with that, we have more pollution emitted into the environment, a greater stress on our natural resources. Basically, we're going to run out of supplies to maintain our standard of living with the number of people that we're predicted to have. Somebody contemplating a PhD, I go back to why do you want to get the degree? What do you want to use it for? Because it really is, it's a personal choice. So not so much as a career choice, but it's something that you're doing for your own personal benefit. So that's what I would tell any student that's contemplating going on for a doctorate. Really closely look at your motivation and how you hope to benefit from having a PhD. For someone that's just close to finishing their doctorate, I would ask them the same question, only a little bit differently. So, how do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you see yourself working? Um, I always encourage more experience. So, no matter what your career choice is, you need experience to judge where you're going to be. And that experience can range from any type of academic or learning experience. It doesn't necessarily have to be directly related to what you've been studying during your doctorate. So I think it's good to get out and learn about other areas of science or engineering because more well-rounded and more marketable in a really tough job market.
Good.
And then for
Hmm.
administrator, I think that was the other question is,
Yeah.
I think the thing that I would advise administrators is to be kind.
Yeah.
It's really hard when you're leading a group of people or you're leading a program to look at things from the people that you're managing from their perspective. But I think being kind is the hardest thing you can do, and the best thing that you can do for those people is just to look at it from their perspective and try to explain the choices that you make as an administrator so that people understand that sometimes things are difficult to do, but this is why we need to do them.